I'm Ken Dodge. I want to thank Ron Haskins for his leadership in putting on this event and Brookings for hosting it. My involvement began a year ago when I was perplexed about these seemingly discrepant findings on pre-kindergarten. There are published reports of positive sustained impact in North Carolina and Oklahoma, other places, but only short-term impact in Tennessee, and why. Susan Gates and I decided that we wanted to sort out these findings, bring together the experts on all sides of the issue. So the first thing we did was to approach three esteemed colleagues, Ron Haskins, Deborah Phillips, and Mark Lipsey. Lo and behold, within 24 hours, we found out that they were interested in doing the very same enterprise. So we decided to collaborate on a two-part venture. The first part is the consensus statement that you've heard about already. As we made our way through that, many of us concluded that perhaps all of the findings are true. Right? And what we need to puzzle out or understand is what is it about the contexts or the programs that lead to different impacts over the short term as well as over the long term. One difference may be the evaluation that's going on. So in Tennessee, it was a randomized controlled trial in which children were randomly assigned to receive a year of pre-kindergarten or not. Children at the end of that year, those who had received the pre-kindergarten program were faring better. And then those groups of children were placed together in kindergarten classrooms, first grade, second grade classrooms, and the differences between those pre-kindergarten children and the control children came together. Maybe it's fade out, maybe it's catch up. The differences differed. In North Carolina, the evaluation was a different one. Here, there were, as states are wont to do, somewhat random differences in the amount of funding given across years and across counties. There are 100 counties in North Carolina. So the evaluation was to compare the highly funded counties to the poorly funded counties within years and across years. And those districts that were highly funded had positive impacts that have been sustained over time. Holland Ladd will talk a little bit about those as well. Now, another difference across these programs, what we've been talking about already, that there may be differences in the characteristics or quality of the kindergarten program itself. There may be differences in the kinds of children who enter the pre-kindergarten, and there may be differences in what happens after the pre-kindergarten and the characteristics of the elementary schools, as we've talked about, the alignment. So the second part of the report that we're turned to now is devoted to understanding these contingencies. Instead of working to achieve consensus on every one of the contingencies, we commissioned individual scholars to address topics in these chapters. Each chapter was discussed, written, submitted to a larger group for scrutiny, written again, revised, reviewed by colleagues, revised and reviewed again. We have several members here to give their perspectives on the part of the report, the chapters that they have written, as well as we're very fortunate to have a national expert in early child development and pre-kindergarten who is not a part of this process at all to provide an independent perspective. So first, before I introduce folks, I want to highlight a few of the chapters that are not represented here today. One, we did hear a little bit about from Greg Duncan earlier, and that is one contingency is whether children might benefit more from one kind of curriculum than another kind of curriculum. So I point you toward that chapter in the report. Greg highlighted it a little bit. I want to go in just slightly more detail. Jade Jenkins and Greg Duncan, both from University of California, Irvine, reviewed the many studies of curricula. And as Greg noted, they found, first of all, that 41% of programs use what is called a whole child curriculum. That is a child-centered strategy to encourage children to learn through coordinated activities. Montessori is one example. There are many others. But to implement this strategy, curriculum effectively, teachers need to be well-trained, and that's not always the case in scaled-up programs. They found that 25% of programs use skill-based curricula, whether it's specific math skills, literacy skills, or even social-emotional skills, are taught through age-appropriate, structured exercises. Building blocks is an example of a math curriculum being used in Boston. Paths is an example of a social-emotional curriculum being used in many classrooms. And finally, they found 34% of programs are either using no curriculum or a very locally developed, not evaluated curriculum. Jenkins and Duncan found that skills-based math curricula are, quote, quite successful at boosting math achievement relative to either a whole child or locally developed curriculum. Literacy curricula are modestly successful at boosting literacy achievement relative to these same alternatives, unquote. Also, quote, curricula and teacher training modules directed at improving children's social-emotional skills and self-regulation have demonstrated success when compared with usual classroom practice, unquote. So their general conclusion is that the curriculum makes a huge difference, and programs should not be left to, in an ad hoc way, implement whatever that they want to at any point in time. Another chapter was authored by Dale Farron of Vanderbilt University when she examined other kinds of structural and process characteristics of what goes on during the pre-kindergarten classroom year. She found several processes that, quote, appear to be important, unquote, mainly focusing on what it is that the teacher is doing, not the teacher's credentials or education level necessarily, but rather what it is that teachers are doing in their classroom. Specifically, she found important positive results from, quote, the teacher's language complexity, level of instruction, ability to engage children's attention, and use of more affirmation and warmth and less disapproval, unquote. Another chapter was authored by the economist Lynn Carrolley from Rand. She examined the costs and benefits of scaled-up pre-kindergarten programs. You might be familiar with findings heralded by Jim Heckman and a number of others heralding the huge benefit-cost ratios that accrue from some early childhood programs. But what about when a program is scaled up and implemented statewide? So Lynn Carrolley investigated the benefit costs in this case. She found first that in order to ensure high quality, the cost can be as much as elementary schooling. That is, she found $8,628 on average per child per year for a scaled-up pre-kindergarten program, with as high as $12,400 in Boston and even $15,350 per child in New Jersey. Lynn reached these three conclusions. First, the estimates of returns for scaled-up programs are in the range of 2 to 1 are likely to be in the range of 2 to 1 to 4 to 1. These estimates are not as high as the estimates for the Perry program and Abecedarian and others, but they're very high nonetheless. Number two, the economic returns are likely to be higher for more expensive programs and better quality programs, even if they are more expensive. So that even with the greater expense, the financial return is likely to be even better. And number three, the economic returns are likely to be higher for economically disadvantaged children. However, the total benefits to society can be larger for universal programs compared with programs targeted at only low-income children. All right, another chapter authored by Steve Barnett examines the issues in scaling up and maintaining high fidelity and quality to the original model as programs get scaled up and rolled out statewide. Steve points out challenges, particularly, for example, in teacher turnover and management, which is common, perhaps because of the low income, because of the kinds of contexts in which they work. Also, most programs he found are, when they get scaled up, the per child level of funding goes down in an effort to try, perhaps a well-intentioned effort to reach more children, but the quality and the funding level per child goes down. He cites positive examples, though, of scaling up in New Jersey and North Carolina. Ron Haskins has written a chapter about the challenges in financing early childhood programs. He concludes that if the aim were to provide a universal pre-K program in this country, a voluntary one, where not all children would choose to participate, even with modest quality, the annual additional cost could be $8.78 billion per year. Ron is realistic and sanguine about whether our society will actually fund pre-K fully, although he holds promise for some states to provide significant increases. At this point, I'd like to add my personal reflection about the context of $9 billion per year. Compare that amount to what we outlay to benefit my generation in terms of Social Security. If my generation were to defer receiving Social Security for just 2 or 3 years, all of early childhood programs could be fully funded. Now, my generation's not going to willingly give up those dollars if they think those dollars are just going to go to the general budget. However, if I could be guaranteed that my savings would be directed to early childhood programs of high quality in my community, I, and I think many members of my generation, my age cohort, would gladly work for a few extra years. So please put it into that context. All right, now, we have several authors of chapters here today who will now provide their perspectives on key issues. I'll introduce the entire team first, and then we'll go one by one just to expedite the transition. First will be A.J. Chaudhry, who was formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy at the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and now a scholar at New York University. Craig Ramey is Professor and Distinguished Research Scholar at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and University, and one of the architects behind the Abecedarian program. Helen Sunny Ladd is the Susan B. King Professor of Public Policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy and the Center for Child Family Policy at Duke University. There are several other members of the task force and the team who are in the audience that I'd like to point out, including John Pruitt, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Early Learning at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and the architect of North Carolina's, originally more at 4, now NC Pre-K program. Edward Fisk, Ted Fisk, formerly education editor of the New York Times, and frequent author of reports on education. Sharon Landesman-Rainey is here of Virginia Tech University, also part of the Abecedarian program. The entire team is listed in the report. And then finally, we're going to be delighted and grateful to have Professor Brenda Jones-Harden reflect on the report. She is not part of the task force, but is a nationally renowned scholar of early child development and pre-kindergarten, and she's professor in the College of Education at the University of Maryland. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to A.J. Chaudhry.
Thanks, Ken, for both inviting me to participate in today's panel and asking me to participate in the development of this volume and pulling it all together in a very, very short time. It's very impressive. And thanks to Brookings and Ron Haskins for hosting this event. I think it's good to have these two panels and synthesis efforts together, in part because moving from the first discussion about how we sort of parse out how we develop a shared sense of what has been, to this point, I would say a very significant amount of evaluation research, but on what has occurred in what are some very dissimilar contexts, looking at dissimilar program design and services, employing different research methods. And in part, in my few minutes, I'm going to offer some description of what exists, to put some of this into context, and discuss the nature of the variations that occur in policies across existing programs and that propose challenges for states and localities as they look to build on public preschool education in the future. So in summary, I'll say quickly that the number and characteristics of children participating in public pre-K varies greatly across the states, as do the types of program services and policy choices for nearly every key element of program design that you can imagine. And this makes this is something that both policy makers like the commissioner and researchers like the others on the panel really need to take into account in thinking about the next steps forward to really understand what exists and what moves forward. So one, how does public pre-education services vary? So states and localities have been building and implementing programs over the course of the last 25 years, that's sort of the age of public pre-kindergarten, that differ tremendously across many great dimensions: who the kids they serve are, what ages they serve, what hours they provide, who teaches, what the content of the time in the classroom is spent on. Even what is called pre-kindergarten varies. In some places, it is a specific, largely separate and standalone program of services run by a government agency and then linked somehow to the K-12 education system. I think that's what most of us hold in our mind when we're having these conversations and thinking about it. But in many others, probably in more others, it is primarily just, in many states, it's just a funding stream that is often combined with other early care and education funding streams to support service provision. And really, there's a hodgepodge across that continuum. You can have programs that are truly integrated with the K-12 system, of which there are a few. There's some that are trying to go there and get closer to that all the time. And then there are others where, preschool is just money that goes into school districts to begin to provide services or to mix with other money to provide services. Also, you have to understand pre-kindergarten services have been developed and exist in the context of a broader landscape of center-based preschool education. And I'm just talking now for children's ages 3 to 4 across the US. And it's actually just a minority subset of those. So there's 130, in our chapter in the report, we say there's 130, from the National Study of Early Care and Education, there's 130,000 centers across the country, or providers of school-based, I shouldn't say centers, providers, so they could have multiple centers in the country, of which 36,000 or less than 30% receive any pre-kindergarten funding. Most states and localities have been adding pre-kindergarten services over the last 25 years. They've been building on top of similar center-based preschool services, including a large share who've been attending private center-based preschool programs or private center-based preschool programs that have existed longer, Head Start, the federal program, and subsidized center-based childcare provided with federal and state funding. These existed prior to the development of public pre-kindergarten services, and the emergence of public pre-K has altered and made an already complex and fragmented landscape more so, especially when it comes to issues of governance and policy. So what does this landscape look like? Well, actually, so currently, or in recent years, about 4.5 to 5 million of 8 million 3- and 4-year-olds are in some sort of public center-based preschool. And that number actually has not changed very much in the last 10 years. We've been in that range for 10 years, and actually more, even though there's much more attention being put on public pre-K education and preschool right now, most of the dynamic growth and the shifts in the distribution of who provides preschool occurred in the 40 years before that, so between 1965 and 2005. And in the book I talk about how this happened in basically there were two major growth periods and dynamic change periods. One, from 1965 to about 1990, there was a huge expansion in private preschool education, and we went from about 10% of kids, of 3- and 4-year-olds in public preschool to 40% of kids in that very short period of time. But almost all of that growth was in private preschool, and by 1990, so a whole generation earlier, almost the majority of 3-year-olds as well as 4-year-olds in families in the top quintile of the income distribution, as well as of a majority of children whose mothers were working and college educated, have been attending preschool for 1 to 2 generations already. And we had very stark disparities between that group, or the top third of the income distribution, and everyone else. The second big dynamic growth period was the expansion of public pre-kindergarten, most of which occurred in the 90s. From about 1992 to about 2005, there's a big expansion in public pre-kindergarten. Also, starting about 1992, there was also large annual increases in both the Head Start program and the Child Care Subsidy program in those in the late 90s as well. So that period, then you see a large increase, and there's a chart in the in the report on page 6 that shows you the difference in the sort of expansions of public and private preschool. And then with the onset of the Great Recession and tightness in state budgets, there has been very modest changes over the course of the last 10 years. Then with the emergence of public pre-K, one of the things that has shifted in the landscape is the differentiation of services for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. Again, in public pre-kindergarten, as it's cited in the report, most of the design has been for, quote, a pre-K year, which is an interesting expression used in the first panel. Pre-kindergarten services are shifted to designing one-year programs, while the majority of other services to kids are generally seen as sort of 2-year sequences. Not that they're developed well as 2-year sequences, but so, for example, in pre-K, there's 6 times as many 4-year-olds across the country being served as 3-year-olds. But if you look at private, and there's a chart in the chapter as well, on page 7 of the report that shows that when you look at private preschool education, when you look at Head Start, and when you look at child care subsidies, and when you look at the usage among families in the top third of the income distribution, they're almost a 1-to-1 ratio. And in fact, there are more 2-year-olds in higher income families that are in center-based education than there are 3-year-olds, and the average child in the modal amount of services for a child in the upper end of the distribution is 2 or 3 years of private preschool education or private prior to kindergarten education than others. So we've seen sort of a pulling apart. And in one way, public preschool actually helped to narrow some of the gaps for low and middle-income families in private preschool, but there's still sizable gaps. So half of all children with family incomes below $100,000 are in center-based, 3 and 4-year-olds are in center-based preschool in 2015, and 3/4 of those rely on public preschool. 3/4 of all children who make over $100,000 are in public preschool, and 3/4 of them are in private preschool. So they're attending very different preschool programs. And so when we talked about the variation in what occurs when kids arrive in the kindergarten classroom, and this is also corresponds to a period where the school readiness gap at 5 is also splaying. It's widening tremendously in the period between sort of 1975 and 2000, when this gap in prior experiences before kindergarten is widening. I'm going to sort of skip over to sort of my last set of remarks, which is around the policy and governance challenges. So in addition to these issues around program design, around the choice of what age to serve, around whether and how to design the program so it might reduce disparities in access, there's a whole host of other policy questions on which there's a lot of variation and a lot of choices to be made. There's issues around service settings. So again, we have in mind something that looks like it's a play-based resemblance of kindergarten in a school building. Well, that's not really what exists in most places. There's the issue of mixed auspice, which can be a positive thing. But this pre-K can occur in school settings, community settings, nonprofit settings, for-profit settings, within government agencies, and the chapter we talk about discusses some of the variation there. Program hours. Most preschool is part day for 1 year, 3 hours, compared to multiple years of full day that higher income children receive. But I will say that Georgia and Oklahoma and the District of Columbia offer 6 hours or more among the places that provide universal or near universal services. And actually the only place that provide universal services to both 3 and 4-year-olds for a full day is the District of Columbia. Finally, curriculum is an area where there's huge variation, and Greg and his co-author do a great chapter on that, and that's been discussed. My last two comments will be around the workforce, which I do want to say there's a tremendous amount of variation, a lot of work to be done about how we look at what are the qualifications that are expected in preschool education, with that work also looking at what the compensation that goes with that. Because you can have high qualifications, but you don't get the highest quality people with those qualifications if you don't have income levels that can draw them in or retain the highest quality ones. And then also what type of training and professional development are provided to increase quality levels. Because even if you don't have high quality levels for beginning teachers, there's ways that we've seen in some research studies that you can increase it. And then finally, around governance, there is no common governance structure. How much is determined, set at the state level, and how much is determined in local school districts and public pre-kindergarten varies a lot. You know, state budget appropriations, legislatures, and administrators have a lot of levers that they can push around the amount of funding, how to prioritize who gets served. But a lot of the sort of nitty-gritty about hiring practices and other things occur at the school district level. In many places, pre-K has been advanced by local school districts and not by the states, including some of the broader expansions like the Boston public school expansion we just heard. And then there's a huge amount of fragmentation relative to the other services in this domain. So public pre-K tries to coordinate with Head Start, and that happens a little bit in some places. In some places it happens a lot more, DC being one of them, again, on that issue. But again, pre-K is a component of a larger service system of which there is no major coordinated governance structure. And with that, I'll
Thank you.
to Craig.
Thanks, Ken. I am very thankful and excited to be here today to be part of this effort. I'm thankful because I think that the consensus statement is strong, broad, and well defended, and will be easily understood by people of goodwill. I'm excited for a number of reasons, the most important of which is that I believe that when the history of the kind of endeavors we're here to talk about is written 25 years or so from now, this particular meeting and the efforts that led up to it will be regarded as an absolute turning point in the conversation in ways that I hope to elaborate on very briefly. I also want to thank Ron Haskins and the Brookings Institution for having this discussion here in Washington, D.C., because I believe that this is where the discussion should start, and it will go into every state and every county in every state as the word goes out. Why do I think this is so important? I hear a deep and resonant consensus that we need to move to a full lifespan perspective if we are to understand how the various systematic interventions that we make in life to improve outcomes, be they educational, health, or in social services, is really misguided if we take a too short a window span. I thought that Deborah was absolutely articulate beyond words to say that we're talking about very complex forces that build over time, that come together to set the stage for the challenges that each and every human being on Earth faces at the next stage. We do differ in the rate at which we get there, and we differ in where our apogee is at the top. I believe that this set of discussions will put to bed the issue of critical periods, thinking that if we just do something right at one point, we will have a guarantee of outcomes far into the future. What I believe it challenges us to do, and it challenges us to move beyond evaluation and into in-depth research, is that we must understand the particular behaviors and mechanisms that bring about change so that we can then, with confidence, induct new teachers, help parents understand, help the children themselves grow and learn in ways that we can assess and measure along the way and take corrective actions whenever that is necessary. And because it's a very complex system, corrective actions are going to be needed very frequently. I come out of an aerospace family, and we know very well that if you don't make decisions second by second, it's really much shorter than second by second, things can go awry and go awry in disastrous ways. We are talking about the most complex thing that's ever been studied, how to regulate the course of human development to produce a larger quantity of competent, caring individuals who will carry on a participatory democracy and a competitive economy. I believe we are up to the challenge. I believe that we have the theoretical models. I believe we have the analytical capability. I believe we have the resources to carry this out, and I believe we have a 50-year history on which we can build to recognize that the questions now have changed. We are into a fundamentally new era, and the question of whether we can have an effect or not is no longer the question. We must engage in more comparative and deep understanding of what is actually being changed and how it sets the stage for what children encounter next. So I believe, in conclusion, that we can go forward with confidence, knowing that curiosity works in our favor. We do have questions that have not been adequately addressed, but that the challenges that go with doing nothing suggest to me that the stakes are actually beyond what any of us have so far calculated. I think the next stage in our inquiry is going to be uplifting and very exciting. Thank you.
So I'm delighted to be here. I, like Ken, am from North Carolina, and with Ken and a third colleague, Clara Sorry. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I, like Ken, am from North Carolina and have had the opportunity to work with Ken, a psychologist, and Clara Mushkin, a sociologist, on evaluating the North Carolina More at 4 program. It's now called the North Carolina Pre-K program, for which we found quite large effects all the way through elementary school. So we've looked at outcomes in 3rd through 5th grade. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to put my policy analysis hat on to force us to go beyond just the question of whether there are positive effects of these programs, which the consensus report concludes there are, to ask questions about of the type, are they good investments? And how should we redesign those investments to make them the best? So I want to talk just very briefly about 3 of the chapters. One is the one Ken already referred to, the chapter by Lynn Carrolley on benefit cost analysis, a chapter by me on subgroup effects, and a 3rd chapter by William Gormley on whether programs are better investments if they're targeted preschool or universal preschool. So just very briefly, picking up on Ken's comments on Lynn Carrolley's paper, I think it's important to ask the question, are investments in early childhood or preschool programs good investments? And as Ken mentioned, Lynn's very careful study and thoughtful study of using the term of social benefit cost analysis concludes, based on the studies that have been done, and there aren't as many of those as we'd like because these programs have effects over time, she concluded that investments in preschool programs would generate greater benefits than costs, and as Ken said, in the range of $2 to $4 of benefit for each dollar of cost. Now, a couple of key notes about that. These benefits that she's talking about are benefits that accrue to lots of different groups of people, to the participants, to taxpayers in the form of perhaps reduced costs for special education, ultimately as better prepared students are in the labor market, eventually in the form of tax savings, but also to society in general in the form of lower crime costs. All of those go into a benefit cost analysis. I emphasize that because this is a challenge for policymakers. The benefits do not all accrue at the local level or at the state level or to the groups making decisions about the investment. The other aspect of the benefit cost analysis is its emphasis on the fact that these benefits accrue over time. And sometimes we have to make estimates, and she spends a lot of time talking about how we make those estimates and projections. There's uncertainty about this. But in any case, what we're talking about here is investments that will lead to benefits over a long period of time, and that makes it harder to sell them. But we need to sell them as investments, not as programs that will generate immediate benefits. So one of the questions that comes up throughout is, if we're going to make these investments, we know they're costly. Should they be targeted at the most disadvantaged students, or should they be universal? I don't have a lot of time. From a cost perspective, you might think, well, they should be targeted, and if you pair that with one of the consensus findings that says the most clear effects are for disadvantaged students, you might think, well, maybe these programs should be targeted. But a key point that is emphasized throughout and in Lynn's paper on the benefit cost analysis is the programs have to be high quality. So then the question is, if we go ahead and invest in a universal pre-K program, there may well be reasons that this would lead to the higher quality programs that are absolutely essential for everyone, including the disadvantaged students. We may be able to deal with the workforce pay issue. We may be able to attract better teachers into these programs. So there's a trade-off here that we're not going to resolve today, but is worth a lot of discussion. If we want quality programs, we may want to invest in universal programs and justify those on the fact that there are benefits not just to disadvantaged kids, and the evidence shows, but to all children. So let me stop there.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Ken, for inviting me, and thanks for this great panel. This was great reading over the last couple of weeks, and I will use this in my classes with my students in early childhood. So my brief comments are going to be based on a couple of my recent experiences. One, conducting with my colleague Elisa Klein the evaluation of Maryland's pre-K program. So we're now going to be on your bibliography in a couple years, so I'm glad to say that. But also a couple of evaluations I'm involved in D.C., as well as my role as a faculty member in the early childhood education program at the University of Maryland. So I'm going to make a couple comments that build on some others and some chapters in the book, and a couple of comments that just come from my own read. First of all, one of the absent pieces in this work, I think, writ large, not just this topic, this text, is what are the parent contributions to the uptake of pre-K, and this is something that I live with daily in my work, and the text, I think, really did a good job of trying to help us think about what those early home experiences might be prior to the pre-K year. But one of the things that I'm really interested in, and holding out my tin cup to lots of foundations, to try and do some home visits on our pre-K evaluations so we can talk about simultaneous home experiences, like, for example, whether the parents are even getting the kids up to take them out there, but also whether there's stressors in the home. I think, Sunny, in your chapter, you even talked about in a few evaluations, they've started to look at the mental health needs of parents. So those kinds of things, I think, are critical to look at. The other thing for me, again, in living with this currently, is what child factors really are being considered in the delivery of pre-K. I'm very moved by some of the differential susceptibility kinds of issues that have been raised, and how we can think about whether teachers are even connecting what they're giving to children based on children's factors. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're addressing that a little bit in our teacher preparation program. I also was very appreciative of the black box issue, but I think there's some other black box issues that we need to address, and we're trying very hard in our study, particularly in Baltimore, to see if we can do it. It's not just what of the curriculum, but how the curriculum is being implemented. Baltimore City, for example, many of you who live in this area might know, have the same curriculum across the city, but let me tell you, having been in these classrooms, I do not see the same thing. Like Greg talked about, he saw the same thing from year to year. I don't see the same thing from day to day. But that's, something that I think we're trying to look at in as many ways as we can. Another thing that's come up for us a lot is the concentration of risk in classrooms. We have found some very good, high-quality teachers with very high-quality curricula. When they get into classrooms where, for example, I just visited a classroom last week where there are about 7 little boys who probably need to be in a therapeutic nursery. That curriculum is not being delivered at all, I can tell you. So one of the things that we're really interested in looking at is this issue of what teachers have to contend with in terms of risk factors into their classroom. The other point I want to raise is, and we have not been successful in looking at this in our particular pre-K evaluation, we're looking at executive functioning. Executive functioning, which you all know is a big deal now, but social emotional outcomes we really haven't done, I think, as good a job as we should, certainly in our evaluation. And I'm thinking about even the studies way back with the child care study where we, learned about behavior problems, but also the recent work of Walter Gilliam where he's talked about the high expulsion rate in preschools and what he's learned about teacher mental health and things like implicit bias among teachers. I think our research would really benefit from looking more carefully at mental health of teachers and how that relates to kids' social emotional outcomes. And then I want to just make a couple of points about, Ken asked me to think a little bit about whether I thought pre-K could reduce the achievement gap. I won't touch that with a 10-foot pole, but what I will say is that I think something Deborah said was so important that we need to really think about how the achievement gap really can be seen as early as the toddler years, and so we have to think very carefully about using those years well and providing high-quality infant-toddler programs. The other thing that I think is important, I really liked in the book this charging station metaphor that people talk about, and I'll channel Deborah's and my graduate school mentor, Ed Ziegler, who always talked to us about how you can't expect a preschool program to be an inoculation against poverty. It's just ridiculous to think about it in that way, particularly because we know not only is poverty a long-term thing, but it's such a complex phenomenon that has so many different things. So I want to say one word about our program, and this relates to Greg's point about individualization. A couple years ago, we made the decision to close our early childhood education, just suspend it completely, and have an early childhood education, early childhood special education program. Partly because of this individualization issue. We felt that we were producing students who could do really well, and they were preschool to 3rd grade trained. So they could go into Montgomery County, for example, and there are some schools in Montgomery County where our graduates are 50% of the teacher workforce. So we know that they've gotten 3 years of pre-K and K and 1 to 3, so they could do pre-K to 3. But we were finding that their individualization skills really lacked. So now we have a totally integrated early childhood education, early childhood special education program where they are learning how to individualize in the way a special educator would. So I'll stop there.
We're going to move to a panel discussion and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers from the entire audience. At this point, I want to recognize, I believe another member of the task force is here, Lynn Carrolley. I'd like to recognize her and her contributions to the task force as well. I want to move to the panel for discussion by opening things with a question about the policy question about whether pre-kindergarten programs will function best and have greatest impact if they are administered universally to the entire population of children in a community or targeted toward a specific subgroup such as children from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. I have to point out that 200 years ago when we contemplated beginning public schooling in the United States, which was going to lead the world, this was a primary question about whether public schools should be universally administered or targeted toward low-income children. There were critics who were saying that it should not be universal because those upper middle class children are going to get their private tutors anyway, and tax dollars shouldn't go to them, but should be administered and directed toward immigrant children who were in particular need of learning how to become citizens of this democracy. Of course, universality won out, and here we are today. So my question for all of you, I want to start with Sonny Ladd, is what are your perspectives on that question, particularly with regard to the potential for children interacting and influencing each other?
Thanks. Happy to comment on this. The North Carolina program, the More at 4 program, now pre-K, is a targeted program. But the neat thing about that program is that it set high standards for size of classroom and what was going on with the standards for the teachers. And each place that offered the, or the entities or providers that offered it could open up to non-funded pre-K students. So what that meant is there were spillovers from the funding that went for the disadvantaged students to the other children because of these high quality standards. The other type of spillover that happened, it was alluded to earlier as Greg was talking about the importance of elementary education. Even if you have a targeted program, if fewer kids are entering kindergarten with no background in schooling, the challenges for teachers are hard. So there are spillovers there. So even with a targeted program, there can be positive spillovers to others, and that may be a justification for the targeted program. But I think we need to come back to the more basic question. What are we trying to do? We've long past that early period when we thought K through 12 education was just for disadvantaged. Would we ask the question today, should grade 2 education just be, public K2 education be just for disadvantaged kids or for everyone?
AJ.
So I agree with everything that Sonny just said, and before the meeting, Deborah had indicated, repetition is good. So I want to highlight a couple of things that Sonny said with, some of the information in our chapter here is that, first of all, the problem with access to preschool education is one that extends across most of the distribution by family income. So when I said that half of all kids below 100,000 within families with income below 100,000 don't attend, that doesn't vary that much across that distribution. So we show in a chart that actually families that are near poor attend preschool less than families that are poor, and families that are moderate income, so with incomes between 200 and 400% of the population, 400% of the poverty level, or between $50,000 and $100,000, only attend preschool 4 percentage points more than the poor. And then it jumps by like 30 percentage points at the next sort of income level. So this goes to the point of what we're asking, and the other thing to say is, as I've said, there's been across two generations, higher income families have been sending their kids to preschool. Their test scores at kindergarten entry have gone really high. That is the primary source of the increase in the achievement gap, is that better off kids are doing so much better. Whether that's attributable to preschool, I don't have the answer to that, but it corresponds to the timing of when preschool expansion occurred. And there also, and there's other research to show that children from higher income families are less likely to then go to K-12 schools that mixes very much over this period by family income. So the rest of the kids are all in situations where, as you say, their teachers are having a Herculean task that they're taking care of the most disadvantaged and the moderately advantaged, and trying to teach and differentiate within that level. So I think that really, there's a tipping point at which something is shown to benefit all children, that all children need it, and that you need to have a common starting point for education. That's what got the US to be the first in the world to get to both elementary education and secondary education of any place in the world. But not having done that means we're last in the world now among all developed nations and getting to the point where we start universal education at any point earlier than 5 across the board.
So my next question will be for Craig Ramey. And I want to point out that the other issue that was debated when public schooling was initially contemplated was the age at which it should begin. And the best developmental science 200 years ago suggested that children didn't learn anything before they were 7 years of age. Didn't make a difference. 7 is the age of reason, when children could begin to reason. That was the best developmental science, and hence public schooling began at age 8 or maybe age 7. The developmental science today is quite different and certainly shows the importance of early learning, brain development, neuronal development, and development across the lifespan. So my question for Craig Ramey is this, that we've talked about and heard a lot about that a major contingency of whether the pre-K year has an effect that lasts is what happens before the pre-K year and then what happens into elementary school after the pre-K year. And you talked about it in your remarks, but could you get concrete with some ways in which alignment could occur or is important and needs to occur?
Happy to. We know from multiple studies that by the time really disadvantaged kids are 18 months of age, we can detect measurable problems in their development. Linguistically, cognitively. We're not talking mainly about motor development, but about the ability to think and talk about experiences. If we acknowledge that our science has been moving us into deeper understanding, we're not talking about doing any kind of backtracking on what we have done historically. We're talking about taking advantage of an evolution in a knowledge base, just as we do take advantage of that in any other complex industry, automobiles, jet engines, whatever. So no defensiveness needed from the early childhood community about saying, you know, gee, that 3-month period that was originally planned for Head Start probably in retrospect wasn't exactly what we should have done. But thoughtful people at the time thought that was a reasonable thing to do. So if we are going to engage in prevention, by which I mean supporting the adequate development of individuals to a level that's somewhere near where they can perform, then waiting until age 4 or 3 means that we are engaged in a catch-up proposition. That is not the case for children who come from very advantaged families. And so we need to understand that we have people that have different needs that are detectable very early, that those needs can be met in a variety of ways, at home, in child care centers, in daycare programs, if and only if, I submit, we manage to infuse those situations where children spend time with the developmental experiences that undergird normal, healthy development. And so I would say in conclusion that in order to bring a scientific perspective to this, which I believe is necessary, both a scientific and a developmental perspective, both of which are historically new for this area, that we have to be very careful how we write the right-hand side of the equation, meaning the outcomes that we are interested in. If we write them too narrowly, if it's all about just getting kids ready for kindergarten or just getting their literacy skills tuned up, oh, and by the way, we just discovered we should probably add some math as well, Oh, and then we probably should be doing some thinking about their social skills and how they, well, yes, it is big, it's complex, and the debate should be on what those outcomes on the right-hand side of the equation can be, and then we can do the engineering to look at the relative contribution at different points in development to things we're now debating that in 50 years will seem like red herrings dragged across the stage to distract us from the main point. This country cannot afford to have a substantial portion of its population unable to participate educationally, economically, or civilly, or we will pay a price.
Brenda?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I've been involved recently in a couple of evaluations of 0 to 5 programs, and I would argue, I know this is about pre-K, but that's the way to go. In fact, Ken just did a public policy presentation at SRCD about the importance of 0 to 5. But just quickly, in terms of our evaluations, we found that if kids had 2 or more years of early childhood care and education, their outcomes at age 5 were better. So that's number one thing. But the second thing was and this is a project that we're still involved in, you all might know that Head Start just had these 5 pilot programs to look at 0 to 5 programming rather than just 0 to 3 and 3 to 5. So they had us pay very close attention to things like transitions from the early Head Start to the Head Start program. And one of the things that came out of that was a 0 to 5 early learning framework that allowed us to sort of map on language and literacy from 0 to 5, and even math concepts and science concepts, if you can imagine, in the infant toddler years. So I think this is a way to think about this that moves us away from thinking again that this 1-year inoculation is going to make a difference.
Thank you. We'll go to AJ, and then we're going to open things up.
Great. So again, I'm going to echo some of these things and provide a little bit more context. So the achievement gap, or the learning gap, at age 5 has grown tremendously. It's now 1.2 standard deviations, which for those of you who don't think in terms of standard deviations, which I think 99.6% of the population doesn't. We have some of the people who do in the room, so it's very big. It's huge. It's the size of the learning gap across the entire K to 12 years. So meaning that most of the gap that you see across the years is present at kindergarten entry is the equivalent of about a year of learning for a young child, or the equivalent of about 90 points on an SAT test on the math and verbal sections, if those are markers that you can see better. Well, at age 24 months, half of that gap is also already seen. So a half a standard deviation gap, or 6 months of differential in the learning between the top and the bottom. The other thing, going back to the universal question, is the way the gap has been spreading is not so much from the top. It has been spreading from the top to the bottom, but that's because it's spreading between the top and the middle as well. So the gap between the top and the middle is now equivalent of about 0.6 standard deviations, or you can do the math on the other side, 6 months of learning and so forth. And that same level then is on, one thing Heckman does, expression that I really like of his is skills beget skills. If you don't have that learning then, you build on it. And one standard deviation at age 15 starts to correspond to 2 or 3 years of learning differential that you have at that point. And then the other point on sort of thinking about birth to 5, I will make a quick plug that my colleagues and I have recently published a book called Cradle to Kindergarten. And in the book, we have a chapter on universal preschool, but it's one of 4 chapters on how we should rethink services for the most disadvantaged and make them earlier. Again, that you wouldn't do 3 months at age 4 to address it, and sort of what Head Start should look like in the future, and how we should think about other supports in the birth to 3 years. And in the book, we address the many sort of policy issues, and we take a take on all of them. Universal, what's the evidence, and why would we do universal versus targeted? I mean, I will say that we do call for a major platform that would cost $70 billion a year, $33 billion a year of which would be preschool education. But to put that into context, we spend $620 billion a year or 4% of the United States gross domestic product on K-12 education. If we were just to spend that, say, well, anything that we as a people spend on kids when they turn 6, why are we not spending that on when they're 3? That would be double as how much we're asking to invest. That would be $140 billion. So we're basically saying spend half as much as you spend on the 7-year-old year, on the 3-year-old year, and you can do a full plan to meet the needs that is part universal, part targeted based on what's needed.
All right. Let's go to questions from the audience here in the white jacket. Yes.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon from the New York Times and London Times. I'd like to ask the panelists, what is your view on states funding the universal or targeted pre-K education? Should they increase taxes as it being debated in New Mexico, where there will be beverage taxes to fund this pre-K education? And do you think the federal government should increase funding for pre-K education universally or targeted way?
Sunny.
Thanks. So it is costly. I think the states should be funding pre-K universally. Now, a few states, and West Virginia is the prime example, couldn't do it immediately, so they started out with a targeted notion, but had a planned move to full funding within a few years. And I think that may make sense for some states, so they don't do it all at once. In terms of the federal role, don't forget that education, K through 12 education, is mainly a responsibility of the states. Constitutionally, it's a responsibility of the states. But the federal government does have a role, an equal protection role. So my own sense is the states should be doing this, and then the Fed should come in with financial support, as they already do through Title I for K through 12, but substantial financial support for disadvantaged children in the early years, and special ed.
Craig, then AJ, then we'll go to another question.
I've been working for the last 10 years in Louisiana to help them develop their statewide pre-K program. And one of the things that has been done there, I think, may have some implications for other places. Children who came from a certain cut point below which it was free for them to go to a 4-year-old program. Above that, it was open and people were invited, but there was a sliding scale. So how you finance it, and there's some discussion of that in this report, is, I think, going to require a lot of creativity. Can the feds and should the feds put more money in it? I'd be very surprised if the answer in this room was no. It's really about the rationale that undergirds that request that has to be clearly articulated, I think. And then I think we should be open to a variety of funding mechanisms, but as AJ has pointed out, you don't have to sell this to upper middle class parents. Over 3/4 of them are already doing it. Why are they doing it? Well, 2 reasons. One, their lifestyle requires that their children typically have some place to be while both parents are working, or if it's a single parent family, while one person is working. So, and the other is, they are the biggest consumers of the developmental literature and have come to believe that what happens early is important. And having lived in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, I can assure you that if you were to offer at only $18,000 a year a high-quality program, you would have to, be very careful how you stepped into public, because you'd be overrun. Because in this town, 10 years ago, people were spending well over 20 for pre-K programs.
All right. Quickly, AJ, and then I want to make sure we get to more questions.
So I think there's a reason that we have the pre-K that we have that's going to make this challenging. So as has come up, we only serve 4-year-olds in many places, and in many cases, the amount of expenditure per child is 1/3 of what is spent when parents buy it themselves, right? So, and that's in part because states are fiscally constrained, and they have to take an incremental approach. which is why we get to these issues. But the interesting thing to note is there's a strong democratic will for this, as we've seen from recent referendums. So from places as diverse as San Antonio, Cincinnati, Denver, Seattle, Philadelphia, every place where it's been put on the ballot, people have voted for specific tax increases to do this. And tax increase referendums don't usually pass. If anything, tax limitation referendums do. So this is the one issue on which there hasn't been a tax referendum on this issue in which the populace has not voted to provide some incremental expansion in preschool for it.
Here we go.
So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much. In terms of June O'Connell, a taxpayer, in terms of universal education, I pay a lot of property taxes for a school system that is economically segregated, and it's across the river. So my question to you all in terms of the prospect of going universal is, in the suburban-urban context, school districts are by zip code, and they economically segregate the rich and the poor. So you'd be giving the affluent free pre-child education, but with the same economic instability that you have in, say, parts of Baltimore. On the other hand, in rural areas, districts are contracting because they're losing people. So you might need a bigger and bigger zone to give preschool in the middle of rural Wisconsin or rural Virginia. So my question is, in the universal conversation, how do you look to avoiding sort of the sins of the past?
A quick answer. Professor Ladd.
I do not have an answer, but I want to emphasize a point that many of the speakers have made this morning. There is no single right answer for all parts of the country, and different states are going to have to deal with this differently, and local governments are going to have to work with their states. Both groups are going to have to work with researchers to come up with strategies that meet a multiple of different goals.
And if I could just comment, actually, when you raised the point about universal targeted, that was the first thing that came to my mind. We have de facto segregation, certainly in the areas that I work, and even though DC has school choice and there are lots of parents who are going all over the place, what I'm seeing is the most disadvantaged children are stuck in certain areas, and that's where they go to school for K-12. So in terms of the post-pre-K factors, they are experiencing the most horrendous schools. But also I would argue that their pre-K experience is tough. They don't get to experience the middle-class kids that sort of support the kind of thing that we're talking about in terms of universal and the lack of stigma. So what our approach has been, because we only train teachers, for example, who are going into the kinds of programs that I evaluate, is we teach them how to work with a particular set of children. We have behavior management classes. We have everything under the sun. We make them go on community walks. We make them learn Spanish. I mean, as many things as we can to sort of help them understand that they have to deliver pre-K in a particular kind of environment. And I just feel like that's a reality that we should take on.
We are out of time, so let me turn it back over to Ron Haskins.
So that I can say goodbye, thank you so much for coming, and join me in thanking the various presenters.